You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
And a very good evening to you all. Thank you ever so much for joining me on tonight's Haunted Histories here, only exclusively, and aren't you so darned lucky, Parasearch Radio. If you listened to the show beforehand, it would have probably confused you, because it was a rerun of a previous Supernatural chat show, as Richard Case, who was due to be Sean's guest tonight, had to was unwell, so they had to replay one at the last minute, but I'm sure he'll be back at some point for anyone looking to hear what he has to say. So how are we all? What's everyone been up to? Sure you've been out reading and ghostying and swatting up on whatever it is you choose to do in your spare time. Have you gone and subscribed? Hi Rich! Have you gone and subscribed to our new YouTube channel yet? Yep, there is going to be content going up on there. You'll actually get to see what us presenters look like in the flesh. Nah. There's a reason why we do radio, you know. And talking of seeing presenters in the flesh, I have a favour to ask from anyone who's listening to the show tonight. Our boss and producer and the evil queen, as she's now been called, Kerry Greenaway, had decided that we're all going to do Facebook Live Q&As. Hi Kaz. And guess what? It's my turn to do on this Sunday, so if you like me or even if you don't, I don't care. Please tune in. Ask me a question so that I'm not just staring at a camera like Billy No Mates for half an hour, because, well, I know you wouldn't do that to me because I'm a nice person. You'll tune in, won't you, please? Pretty please, 7 o'clock, Sunday, on the group page. Come with a good question for me, a good history question, or just anything really. I can talk about anything, as you can probably guess. So, what are we up to tonight? Well, tonight we're going down under. And it was actually, this show was actually a request of Mr. Richard Clements. He every so often, he chucks ideas of shows he'd like me to do across to me. He wants the Haunted Histories treatment. And this one was one he actually mentioned to me last year. I think it was late last year, and I've been sort of putting the plans in motion and using my Australian... Hi Mark, good to see you! Using my Australian contacts to find someone who could chat about Port Arthur in... Yay, Penny, you got questions, have you, Kaz? Oh, good. Well, at least you'll be there talking to me. No, I think she said half an hour to an hour. I've got to be gone by 9 o'clock at the very latest so that everyone listens to Kerry's show. You know, she doesn't really want us watching us live. It's just she's pimping us out, mate. Pimping us out to the public. Anyway, that aside, yes, so Australia. We're off to Australia. Now, the thing is about Gary, his knowledge is pretty darn good. So what we... yeah, good Mark, you're going to be tuning into my live on Sunday, 7 o'clock. Please do. Please, everyone, tune in. Keep me company. But anyway, digressing. You know when I'm talking live, because I digress a lot. There's only going to be a few more minutes of this live stuff. Don't worry, we're going to be going to the interview in a minute. But Gary he's a very seasoned investigator, does an awful lot of historical research as well. He's a bit like me, a bit like Bill Taboni, who you obviously know, Sarah Chumacero, who you know, is all part of that same gang. And so rather than do my sort of normal 15-20 minute spiel on the history, We put it all into one big interview, one big conversation. So I think the easiest thing is if I just play it and you let me know what you think. Okay, now, guys, I love you. I will do anything for you. You guys who listen to the show and download the show and everything else. But normally, the only reason I'm still up at 2 a.m. is because I have a torch in one hand and a K2 meter in the other one. But on this occasion, it's because I'm talking to a lovely new guest all the way from Australia. Now, our guest Gary Sullivan is a good friend of Bill Tabone, who you all know has been on the show quite a few times. He actually lives in the same part of Australia as Bill as well. He's got a very long history of the paranormal. 39 years or so we've worked out, wasn't it, with our basic maths of how long you've actually been doing investigations. So you were basically doing it from a fetus in the womb.
Almost. Almost. You're giving away my age now.
I thought I was 39. He's part of a team called Forever Haunted with his co-pilot, Anthony Kilner. He's done the television thing. He was the lead investigator on a show called Haunted Australia. He's working on a book at the moment with Anthony, which has got a really interesting premise, and I'm looking forward to reading it when it does come out. And we'll be all over that on the show. Rest assured, Gary, we'll be talking about that one when it does come out. But yes, Mr. Gary Sullivan, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Penny, and thank you very much for having me on your show. And I've got to say, I love your accent. I think your accent's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
By the way.
Oh, the thing is, we'll let people in on a sit. I have actually just been talking about how much I love the Australian accent because I find it a very, very easygoing, cheerful. It just makes me smile. Even when I get messages through, from people like Sarah Chimasero and Bill and everything, I actually read it in my head in an Australian accent, and it just makes me smile. So, bit of mutual accent love going on here.
Accent. I love the English accent because there's so many different dialects, so many facets to it. Yeah. But look, we're just boring. We just got the one accent. We love it, but it's just us.
I don't know. You've got different variations of the Aussie accent, though, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, little bits. There's little bits here and there, but it's still overall it's still the same.
Is it? Oh, okay. Oh, I like it. I do like it, but thank you for the compliment. So, anyone who listens to my show knows that when I get a new guest on, I go nosy and I start asking them questions. And one of the first questions I normally ask is, where was your first ever investigation?
Oh, now you're pushing my memory. See, now I'm really getting old. But look, the thing that I recall as being my first in my memory banks here is when I was a kid. I was about 15, 16 years old. Mm-hmm. I went into a national park down here in Victoria, in the southeastern suburbs. I went out into this park with a few friends of mine, and we came across an old hut, an old wooden hut. And I didn't know it at the time, but that actual wooden hut was part of an old police barracks from the 1800s where the colonial police were on horseback and they had the black trackers, the Aboriginal trackers with them, and they looked after, like the colonies and that sort of thing. So we came across this hut. Anyway, we were curious about it, so we went back the following day and not having any equipment, we didn't know what to do. We weren't really investigators, so we were curious, but we went there and that was basically my first time investigating with a couple of guys who we all had the same interest.
Cool. And have you investigated much outside of Australia, or has most of your work been on Australia?
Look, most of it's been here in Australia. In fact, I'd probably say all of it has.
Okay.
I've done the odd little bit in England. I did go to England back in 1990, but I didn't go on any major investigations. I was only sort of there briefly.
Yeah.
Same as in America. I'd been to America before, but not done any full-on investigations there. But most of them, 99.9% of them, all here in Australia.
So if someone was coming to Australia and they said to you, give me the 3 best places I could visit.
Ooh, let's see. Arradale's got to be one of them. Arradale is like, you guys would probably know, you've probably heard Bill talk about Arradale, but Arradale is like the pinnacle of anywhere to go that's haunted, because it's right up there at the top. So I'd definitely put Arradale on the list.
It's also got a fascinating history to it as well, hasn't it? And the building, the way it's laid out, and all of that. It's quite.
Yeah, absolutely.
It reminds me almost of a military barracks, the way it's set up.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Well, you've got a mirror image. You've got a male and female wing. They're exact mirror image of each other. But there's reasons for that, and I'm sure Bill's sort of spoken to you about those. But look, one of the other places I always put on the list too is go to Tasmania. Tasmania is a beautiful little island just south of the mainland. You got places like Port Arthur. You got places like New Norfolk, and basically all of Tasmania is it's steeped in history. So there's lots of places to go to there as well. So. And look, same as in South Australia, you've got the Adelaide Jail, you've got New South Wales, you've got Berrima. There's hundreds of places. So just to name a few, there you go, just a couple.
So have any of the places you've investigated ever scared you?
Yeah, look, I'll be honest and say yes. I'm not above being scared by any means. It takes a lot to rattle me, but yeah, and Arradale, believe it or not, was it. I actually first went to Arradale well before anyone else. I was the first person to actually investigate. I was very privileged to be the first to have a team there to investigate Arradale. And, there were things that happened there. I actually came across a person, a real person that I presumed was a real person, didn't look any different to me than a normal person. And I just walked into a room and this person was standing in the doorway. So I'd spun around to have a look and they were gone. I thought, maybe they've done a runner. But the room that I was in, outside of that, was about a 50-metre long corridor. So, and they were nowhere to be seen. So you couldn't run that fast, even if you were Usain Bolt. There's no way you could run that quick. But this person had just disappeared, completely disappeared. So it did frighten me a little bit. It sort of took me by surprise. But the time that I got frightened was the very next day when I analysed what had gone on, because I'd shone a light into this guy's face and he had shadow and everything on his face like a normal person would have. But the one thing that did frighten me was the fact that he never, ever flinched. Now, if I shone a bright torch in your face, you're going to go, oi, what's that? Turn it off. This guy didn't even react. Never reacted at all. He just kept looking at me, and I turned around quickly to let the other guys know there's someone here, and then I turned back and he was gone. So, it was the next day that actually frightened me, not the actual event. It was afterwards. When
you start playing back in your mind and looking back at your notes.
Yep.
Cool. So, if you could investigate anywhere in the world, I know we were talking about sort of the history and the fact that, and this is a similar conversation to what I had with my lovely American guests as well, because Australia and America's history is only really a few hundred years old. Nearly every single one of them says they'd like to come to somewhere like the UK and go to one of the really, really old 1,000-year-old castles, because they just can't comprehend history being, something still standing that's that old.
You can't.
Do you have that same sort of?
Oh, absolutely. Look, we were 1788. Captain Cook came here, so we're only a couple of hundred years old. So being an Australian, that's all you see. That's all you see. But when you look at somewhere else in the world, like England, and you've got castles and buildings there that are up to 1,000 years old, in my puny little brain, that doesn't even register. I can't get my head around the fact that there's a building that old still standing. Just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So, in essence, I'd love to go and visit some of them sort of places you guys have got over there, and to do an investigation in one of them. I reckon it would be absolutely sensational.
It's an interesting one, but it also broaches the question that you don't tend to find many. I call them hauntings. I can't think of another word at the moment to call them. Most of them do seem to be spirits or whatever from the last 100 to 200 years. Even though Britain was, the Romans were in the UK for a long time, there's not that many like Legion sightings, Roman Legion or Roman soldier sightings. Same with, you don't get many, the Saxons, who massive here. Their history, when you look at people like Boadicea or Boudica, it was actually meant to be pronounced, who fought against the Iceni warriors, who fought against the Romans, and her history, if you look it up, it's better than anything you see on Game of Thrones. there's nothing of her
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
meant to be sort of, and it does sort of make you wonder why. It's a question that I've sort of broached and had broached to me on more than one occasion. Is why do they run out of energy? Is that why they stop coming back, or is there something else in it? But it's there's a few. There are quite a few places here.
Well, I guess we'll never know.
No.
I guess we'll never know whether it's. I mean, it could be a cycle as well. We don't know. There's no conclusive evidence as to why, but it could be on a cycle. You know what I mean? We could be in the next 100 years. They could come back. We don't know. We're not. We probably won't be around in another 150 or so years. No. But who knows? We just don't know enough.
I do like freaking my 8-year-old son out though when I took him to the Norwich Castle in Norfolk. And I told him to put his hand on one of the original stones from the original keep of the castle. And he goes, "Why, Mum?" And I said, that stone was put there over 1,000 years ago. And that kind of blew his mind a little bit, to know that he was putting his hand on a stone that was laid there over 1,000 years ago.
Well, it does that to me. Even here, we go to some jails and places like that where you've got the bluestone steps leading up to the next level, and they're all worn away. And you look at them worn away. That's 200 years of wear there. Yeah. And you touch it, and you think, wow, imagine the amount of traffic and things that these stairs have seen, and it's only 200 years old. Yeah. So.
I do like sort of doing that to the kids and giving them that kind of. Telling them who would have been here, and so you're coming to the UK at some point then, is that right, Gary?
Oh, I'd love to, and I don't see when it'll happen though, but I'd love to come over there again. As I said, I was over there in 1990, which is a long time ago now, but who knows when I'll be over there next, and when I do, I'd certainly love to go and visit some of these older places. I can't even think of any off the top of my head.
Let me know and I'll give you the list. You know the presenter of Haunted Histories. Who else do you need to call?
Oh, well, exactly. Ghostbusters, maybe. But no,
I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
Absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, look, I cop that all the time. Don't worry.
I always tell people I'm more afraid of the living than the dead.
Oh yeah. Well, they can't hunt their dead. What are they going to do?
Exactly.
Let's face it.
Exactly. Whereas most people are like, well, I can't fight a ghost. No, you don't need to. Not really. That's the way I look at it. So when you're doing investigations, what are you a kind of more of a sort of a mediumistic type investigator, or do you like using equipment, or are you sort of a bit of everything?
Well, I'm a bit of everything, but I do use a lot of science. But at the same time, using science and using some of the gadgets are all well and good. But in essence, I don't put a lot of faith in it, and that's coming from me being from using science, and science is my background, in paranormal. It sounds strange, but I always revert to the one question and the one question only, and that is, what is a ghost? Simply, we don't know. No. So we don't know what a ghost is. So we're looking for something with equipment, but we don't even know what we're looking for. So therefore, how can we gauge what it does? Does it emit EMF? We don't know. We don't even know what they're made of. So all these gadgets, as much as they work, and they do detect, and they're for a given thing, like picking up EMF, electromagnetic fields, could be natural, it could be man-made. We don't, that's what it's there for, just to pick up. But again, we don't know exactly what we're looking for. So we cannot put 100% faith in all the gadgets that we use. Using the scientific method whereby, you're asking a question, you're conducting your investigation and your experiment and all that sort of thing, which is all fine, but you need to have a controlled environment to do that. And you can't always guarantee a controlled environment when you're investigating. So you do the best with what you have. So again, I don't hold 100% faith in all of the gadgets that we use, and I've pretty much used all of them, even the latest ones, but they are there for a purpose. So, and I rely a lot on my own instincts. As I say, I'm not a medium. I'm certainly not mediumistic by any means, but the one thing I rely on is what's inside my chest, my heart, and what I feel. Yeah. So if I feel that I'm in danger, or I feel that something needs further investigating, then that's what I go with. That I trust 100%.
Okay. So if you are using equipment, what bits of equipment do you feel maybe you trust slightly more than others?
All right. Some of the things I do trust more than others are, for example, thermal imaging cameras.
All right.
Because you cannot hide from thermal imaging. It's point blank. You cannot hide from it. If you're a living creature, you're going to give off a heat signature. So a thermal imaging camera will see that.
Mm-hmm.
So if I see, for example, a human figure that has no heat whatsoever, it's not alive.
Mm-hmm.
It's 100% not alive because it's not giving off heat. So thermal imaging I do put up there. Also, I look at things like, when we talk about EMF, there is a thing called a natural EM tri-field meter. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or any of the listeners have heard of them.
I've heard of tri-field,
but, yeah, but the natural EM tri-field, it has a range of different fields on it. So if you're getting a hit, for example, you put it on the generic field so all of them are active and you're getting a hit, then you can narrow that down. So if I'm getting some EMF coming in, where's it coming? Is it electromagnetic? Is it microwave? Is it radio? Then I've got the button on there to flick it around until it indicates to me what it is. Again, it doesn't mean that there's a ghost there, but it means that I'm picking up on a particular kind of electromagnetic field, so I can document that and say that it was magnetic or so on. And again, do this time and time again, and if you're having experiences with manifestations happening and you're getting a particular field happening, then you just got to do the math, when you put it together and collaborate it.
Okay. So what do you think about things like spirit boxes, Frank's boxes, whatever you want to call them, things like that do seem to have quite opposing opinions on them?
They do, but let's break it down and look at it from a technical point of view. A Frank's box, spirit box, call it what you like, is an FM scanner receiver. It basically scans the FM frequencies. So unless a ghost is broadcasting to you from an FM studio in Epping somewhere and you're picking it up, which is highly unlikely, let's face it, what you're picking up is just FM signals. That's what you're picking up. So you're going to be picking up bits of, depending on the frequency of scanning, it will pick up bits of information from different radio waves. So it's not necessarily, in my books, giving me a true indication of what's there. Okay. Again, it's just a frequency scanner and a receiver.
Okay. Ovilus, things like word generators?
Look, Ovilus is tricky. I don't. For me, I'm sort of on the fence with an Ovilus. I look at it as a random phonetic word generator, right? Which it is. But then again, you can put it into context, and I've seen it in investigations where it comes up with some words that are very, very true to what is at the time. Like I always do my research before I go in, so I know basically what's going on. And if I'm looking at an Ovilus and I'm in a particular spot, mind you, I wouldn't just go in if I'm in a particular spot where I know something's happened and that Ovilus is coming up with things that, not that I'm trying to push, but it comes up with a definite, then, and it happens several times, and I'm going to look at that and go, is that coincidence or is that, what is that?
Yeah.
So again, I don't look at it as a negative with an Ovilus, but I'm just on the fence. I'm in two minds with the Ovilus.
Yeah. I must admit, I'm 50-50. I've had them come up with stuff that can't explain. But I've also seen, I think I said to you before, I've also seen people almost sort of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole to make the evidence fit what the Ovilus is saying.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Again, the obvious, it is a word generator, so it's coming up with random words that it will process and throw at you. Is that the words that the ghost's speaking? Well, I don't know. I guess we'll never know unless we're actually recording the voice. Some sort of an EVP, you're actually recording the voice of a deceased person and it's their voice, not a whisper, then we'll never know.
No. Let's say with spirit boxes, though, I've had some weird things happen with those that I can't explain. Like an ongoing conversation, an intelligent conversation.
Yeah.
That I had witnesses
again,
to, and it's weird. It was a weird one.
It is weird, but all I look at it is from the standpoint of what it actually is.
Yeah.
Not about what it does, because we know what it does. We know that it's scanning, FM frequencies and et cetera, et cetera. So what's the likelihood of you picking up a radio station? It's probably 100 times more than it would be for you to pick up the spirit of a deceased person.
True. I would say I'm on. So, I then look at the fact that, a lot of people like to use Ouija boards. Well, Ouija boards were basically a parlour trick from the Victorian Gothic sort of era. So maybe
they were a game. It's an actual game.
Yeah. So maybe kind of that's where the spirit box is at the moment. but in, say, 50 years, people will be going, well, actually, we do want to use this. Who knows? Who knows where it's going to go? It's an interesting one. But I think, nothing in isolation. Everything just, nothing in isolation.
Yeah. Well, I know the Ouija board, as your viewers or listeners may know, that obviously it's a take on words. It's a production of two words, we and ja, which is, ja is German for yes and we is French for yes. So you've got yes, yes. It's a yes, yes board. So what does that mean? So, and again, I think, don't quote me here, but from memory, I think it was actually made by Parker Brothers as a game.
Can't remember.
As a child's game.
Okay, I know it was. I mean, whereas a lot of people think it's a portal to hell and all that kind of thing, it was a parlour trick with a lot of the things that happened in the Victorian sort of Gothic era when seances became famous and all of that kind of thing, and people thought they had ectoplasm coming out of their noses, which we now know was sort of gauze or like the meshy type material. So it's all interesting. But just talking about the Victorian era, it's a little segue into what we're going to be talking about. And what we're talking about is really the sort of the convicts on Tasmania, and primarily Port Arthur.
Port Arthur, yes.
Port Arthur.
Now
what was Port Arthur?
Well, Port Arthur, it became a penal colony in 1830, but before that it actually was just a community, just a township, which was all part of a town which was known as, Eagle Hawk Neck. Yeah, Eagle Hawk Neck was part of the township of what it was. It had a totally different name back then, but it became a penal colony simply because of the overflow on the mainland. They were getting a lot of convicts coming to the mainland. Some of them were pretty nasty, and they didn't want to house them with the general population, so they would send them off to isolation to a place like Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, as it was known.
Yep.
Send them there because they're out the way, they're someone else's problem, we don't have to deal with them type thing. So Port Arthur itself, it started in 1830 as a penal colony. So some of the convicts that were there, I mean, we had some pretty bad ones there, and we had some pretty mild ones there. I guess we don't know the full reason why all of them were there, other than the fact that they needed to be isolated for whatever reason.
And I mean, Port Arthur, one of the things that I do in my research on this, what was interesting, is when we think, like in today's sort of thinking of convicts being sent somewhere, we expect them all to be incarcerated in a giant prison. But Tasmania had communities of convicts, because there was something like 75,000 convicts were transported to Tasmania during its lifetime as a place of convicts, I suppose. I can't think of another way of putting it. And a lot of those wouldn't have been in places like the Port Arthur penal system, or you'll have to pronounce this one for me again, Gary, Macquarie Harbour, which was another one on the other side of Tasmania. They were sort of living and working almost in society, weren't they? They were working the farms. They were for quite a long time with cheap labour. So it was only the bad ones that were in effect incarcerated.
Yeah, the ones that could not be rehabilitated were incarcerated. The others were let loose on the land to work the land for the betterment of the country, so that we could actually establish ourselves as being a colonised community, not just a penal colony. So it was for the good of the future that they did that. Now, as for locking all the prisoners away, I mean, let's face it, you're 14,000 miles away from anything. You're on an isolated island. You're not getting off there in any hurry. So what's the point of putting you in bars? So you're not going to go anywhere. So that was probably the reason why they didn't lock all of them up, only some of the really nasty ones that they could not integrate into the community itself.
Yeah, and a lot of those who ended up being locked up in Port Arthur, they were reoffenders who'd reoffended since they'd been transported to Australia. Or and it's interesting, when I was reading some of the crimes that they were actually, murder was an obvious one. They'd be put into somewhere like Port Arthur for murder, but also for sometimes for having what they called unnatural crimes that they committed. So things like bestiality, homosexuality, and cannibalism.
And cannibalism, yeah.
Cannibalism.
Yeah, some of the sorts of things that were looked at as being so heinous that they didn't want to talk about. Yeah. That's how heinous they were. They went beyond murder. In fact, it was almost one step closer to being, death, really, when you're going into these sorts of heinous crimes. So they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to know about it. So you were kept in isolation, never to be heard of or spoken about, or the crimes that you committed.
Yeah.
So that's it was a lot of the sweeping under the carpet sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, Port
Talbot, even today we accept it. So
yeah. Well, certain things like homosexuality is not a problem anymore.
Well, homosexuality,
bestiality, and cannibalism.
Bestiality
we don't accept those really. Have a bit of an issue with those. I did read one interesting story about one of a group of prisoners who escaped. I don't think it was from Port Arthur. It was from one of the others. And there was like 8 or 9 of them, and they escaped into the bush and ended up eating each other until there was 2 left, and one of them fell asleep and the other one ate him and got recaptured, escaped again with another prisoner and ate him. And I was sort of thinking, if you knew someone was a cannibal, would you really have escaped with them and then let yourself go to sleep? I probably wouldn't have risked it myself.
Probably not, but then you got to look at his state of mind at the time. Did he do it out of necessity? Was he that desperate that he needed to eat something, so he ate human flesh, or was it an affliction that he had that he enjoyed it and therefore wanted more of it?
I mean, we don't understand. 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. If I'm reading the story, I was reading it earlier. I think it began as necessity and then got to a almost.
An obsession.
Yeah, kind of started to enjoy it. But I mean, especially for people listening from the UK who haven't looked into the history, it's interesting to sort of think about the fact that the convicts who were sent to Tasmania, not all of them, as you say, were in chains or behind bars. They only got put behind bars if they'd done something so heinous that they couldn't be trusted in general population, in effect. So things like murder, as I say, what they called unnatural crimes. But even then, how some of the unnatural crimes, homosexuality was treated, could depend on whoever the governor was at the time.
Exactly, yeah.
Port Arthur was named
There were
after...
crimes...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry, there were crimes that were committed by people, and in Port Arthur, the biggest thing was not about rehabilitation. They wanted to break you, so it was about breaking people. So they used to have what they called the roundhouse, which used to be at Port Arthur, which was a single solitary house. So when you open the door, it basically like a spiral corridor goes around to a central room, in which no light comes in and no sound comes in, and that's how they would break people. They would put them in there for a certain period of time, and it would either send you mad, literally mad, or it would break you and you would become a better person. And there were stories, one particular story, I can't remember the gentleman's name now, but they locked him away in there and he came out and they thought he was a better person, hallelujah, he's been saved, he'd seen the light, so to speak. But he spent many, many months in there, and the only way he kept himself from being sane was on the floor. It was just like a dirt floor. It wasn't concrete or bricks, or just dirt. He would hunt around looking for little pebbles, finding and feeling them and remembering what they felt like, and he would just throw them in the air and then go looking for them again. So it kept him occupied. There were things like that stopped him going mad, which they didn't know about at the time. And then when he was released, they thought he was a changed man and so forth, and another officer tried to break him again, so he punched the officer and he absolutely punched him to the ground. So they thought, well, we can't put you back in there again, you're not going to be rehabilitated, so they sent him over to the Isle of the Dead, which you would probably know about the Isle of the Dead over there in Port Arthur.
The cemetery that's got something like 1,100 people burials there, but only 180 of them marked. That one.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very small island. I've been across to that island, and there are some graves there, but the whole island is pretty much littered with convicts' bodies, and we don't know exactly who they are or where they are. So this guy was sent over there to be the gravedigger, to dig these graves, and he had his own little shack over there, and he only lasted a very, very short time there because he was signalling with a lamp to the guards across the bay there, across to Port Arthur, the settlement, with a lamp to come and get him. So when they went out there to come and get him, he was in a state of panic, and he just said that he has never, ever been so scared in all his life because he met the devil himself while he was on that island, and it scared him into submission to the point where he actually became a model citizen after that. So they couldn't break him at the settlement, but the island did. So that was a big mystery one.
So how you say you've been to the Isle of the Dead?
Yes, I have.
How does it feel?
It is, you know what, without putting it into people's minds as to what it is, if you don't know what it is, it still has that sense about it that you just don't feel right there. But having known what it is, like you do get a sense of degradation when you're there. You really feel heavy, and it's not a nice place. You know, you can walk around there and you just don't, I'd hate to be there over night time, put it that way.
You see, it's funny because I feel quite comfortable in graveyards. Like sort of church graveyards and places like that. I find them quite relaxing places.
Well, so do I at the best of times, and I visit a lot of graveyards. But the difference between the Isle of the Dead and a graveyard is graveyards are consecrated, okay, and they're made with love and they're blessing from God and so forth. The Isle of the Dead, they were just buried there, just dirt.
Right.
So there's no consecration, there's no nothing. It's just raw. You know what I mean? Right. So all those emotions and feelings, I suppose you could call them, of the prisoners or convicts. Again, I'm not sounding romantic here, but I don't know if they're still there. You know what I mean? That they've not been able to let go.
Right.
So
did you have any paranormal experiences there, Gary?
Not on the island. No, I didn't investigate the island. I actually went over there in the evening with another group, but we didn't investigate there. We were just sort of touring around. And also went across to what they call Point Pure, which is across from the Isle of the Dead, and that was where they used to house the boys. So there were a lot of boys there too, young kids, you know, right the way from, you know, like 4 or 5-year-olds right up to teenagers. And when they became of age at Port Arthur, then they went into the penal colony. Yeah. So they weren't actually a part of. They were, but they weren't. It was on Point Pure. So. And again, that's another eerie sort of place, because I'm sure that, like even in other colonies around the world, that kids would have been mistreated, I'm sure. So we don't know. You're never going to know.
TB outbreaks in these places, you know, anything like that, because one of the interesting facts I found was that the life expectancy for convicts who were living on Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, not the ones I just love that name. Or not necessarily the ones incarcerated in Port Arthur or whatever, but just the ones that were in the general population. Their life expectancy was actually a lot higher than it would have been if they were still in the UK. Now, whether that's because they would have possibly still been in the criminal lifestyle, because there was an awful lot of belief back then that it was a criminal class. You know, if you committed a crime, it was because that was the class that you belonged to, and it was hereditary, and you were never going to break out of it. Once a criminal, always a criminal kind of thing. Or was it to do with the fact there was more food, more plentiful food, more meat, that kind of thing? There was less air pollution, and the fact that things like
I think it boils down to lifestyle too. You're here, you're in a strange place, so you don't have all the baggage anymore because you're in a colony, so you want to start a new life. So you've got a better outlook. Yeah. So you're not going to have all that baggage. You're not labelled as such, even though you were labelled, but you could wear that because you know you were forming a new life for you and your future family.
I mean, that would be possible. Why the recidivism rate was so much lower. I think it was something like 5% on Tasmania for these convicts compared to nearly 50% back in the UK where they'd come from. So that could have been why that New Start, they weren't under the pressure to steal or whatever it was that they'd done before.
Yeah, exactly.
To feed their children, or to feed their families, and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I reckon you hit the nail on the head. I reckon that would have a lot to do with it. Would be the fact that they are, or they're convicts, and they've done their time, so to speak. A lot of them, they were sent here for life, but they weren't penalised for life. They were after a certain amount of years, they were given a small grant or a small plot of land, and got told to go and work the land because they wanted to build the country for the future. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that's what they did. So that would have been good for them, and they would have thought, well, you know, I'm free, I'm not in jail, I've actually got my own land, I can start my own life, and therefore recidivism would have gone way down.
Yeah. But obviously there were those people who it was a way of life for them. They were never going to change. Their crimes were possibly going to get worse, and those were the ones that would have ended up in places like Port Arthur. And you mentioned another one that was, where did you say it was? Near Sydney. Was it near Sydney, Norfolk Island? All these kind
Norfolk
of places.
Island, just off the coast of Sydney, yeah.
Yeah. But, so, Port Arthur itself, it's a prison. It's, that's the way to look at it. It kind of was quasi-based on Jeremy Bentham's panopticon idea, which was that a watchman could literally sit in the middle and see everything that was going on without you knowing that they were watching you. I say based on it, but it wasn't quite the same as that.
Not quite. They didn't have anything in the middle. It was up on the guards, which was up on the hill.
But it was that
off to the right near the commandant.
You didn't need someone on every single cell block to see if something was going on. It was kind of a bird's eye view, I suppose you could call it. It was also going to be very similar to Alcatraz. And one of the other it was inescapable. Now, one of the other parallels I saw with Alcatraz is I've seen a lot of stuff that said there were sharks in the bay, so people couldn't swim for freedom. And that's one of the things they always say about Alcatraz, that there's sharks in San Francisco Bay.
Yeah, I laugh at that when I hear that. Look, there are sharks here in Australia, but you're talking about Tasmania. It's very cold. The waters are very cold.
Right.
So you don't have a lot of sharks there. There are sharks, but there's not in plentiful amounts. You get them sort of in the warmer waters. Like we get them in Victoria when the waters are a bit warmer, when they come down from the north. But in Tasmania, it's too cold. You won't get that many sharks there.
Well, isn't Tasmania meant to be closer to the Arctic than it is to northern Australia?
Yes.
Something like
is.
that, which is quite mind-blowing. When you think of how I picture Australia as temperatures, to think that one of your islands is closer to the Arctic, or the Antarctic, it's the Antarctic or the Arctic, whichever one it is, than the northern parts of Australia. I find that quite mind-blowing. But it's a similar thing with Alcatraz. That was one of the rumours that went around about the Alcatraz island, that you couldn't swim, A, because the waters were too cold, and B, because they were full of sharks. And most people, I actually went there, and I actually went on a racing yacht in the bay. And I said to them, are there sharks? And they were like, no. Well, they're certainly not sharks that would eat you. You're more likely to cramp up because the water's cold. So I've seen quite a few similarities to sort of how Alcatraz was, if you like, sold. The PR for Alcatraz, very similar to Port Arthur. But yeah, so it was a prison. People were sent there.
It was propaganda. They basically put propaganda out there. If you told enough people that there were dangerous sharks here, they wouldn't go in the water, so they wouldn't therefore want to escape. So,
but what they did instead to escape was dress up as a kangaroo.
Yeah, some of them did. That's the biggest mistake they could ever do. But there is definitely a story.
Do you want to tell it, or shall I?
No, you can tell it, by all means.
You want me to?
You go ahead and tell it.
There was one
George
Billy Hunt who dressed up as in a kangaroo hide to escape.
Just quickly, Penny, there's a play on words there, and over here we call somebody a Billy Hunt, which is rhyming slang, but you know what I mean and where it comes from now.
I do. Okay, all right. He was a bit of that, yeah. But he dressed up as a kangaroo. I can't say it now with a straight face. He dressed up as a kangaroo, thought he was going to get away, and the guards started shooting at him because they saw a kangaroo and they thought they could fry it up and have a nice meal. And so
and they were also bored. I don't think there was a lot happening, so they thought, well, we need some target practice. And one of the guards was apparently a little bit inebriated and thought, well, I'm just going to have some target practice. No one's going to care if I fire a few rounds. And, oh, look, there's a kangaroo. And so he popped a few shots into this kangaroo, but it wasn't a kangaroo. It
was a man in a kangaroo's hide who had to give himself up and obviously got taken back to Port Arthur and got 150 lashes for the privilege of not only dressing up as a kangaroo but being shot at.
And so he is Billy Hunt.
Yeah, I shouldn't laugh at it really, but I just find that hysterical. I find that a very funny. I mean, credit to him for using what he had to try and escape. But
it's not the best idea. It's not the smartest idea.
No. So that one,
the other thing
I found,
around Port Arthur, that the forest areas around Port Arthur literally are impenetrable. It's very... If you escaped from Port Arthur, you were pretty much doomed anyway, whether the guards got you or not.
All right.
Because you could not get through the so-called... The trees, they grow together, only inches apart, and there are millions of them. It's impenetrable. You can't actually get through it.
So that's probably harder than the mythical sharks.
Much harder, yeah. So, I mean, few had tried and few had perished because they just couldn't go anywhere. They'd starve.
Wow.
Or that sort of thing, or just die of exposure because you can't get anywhere.
Okay.
The only way off the island was by boat.
Right. Okay. So let's go to Port Arthur, the building. I presume you've investigated it a few times.
I've been over there on many occasions, yes, and I've investigated myself as on my own, not part of a group.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you a story about one of the things that did happen. We were part of a tour this particular night, the wife and myself, before we were going to do anything. And we went on the ghost tour, as it were. And me being the skeptic that I am, thought, here we go. Someone's going to jump out and scare the hell out of us, and I'm going to go, yay, I'm scared, that sort of thing. So didn't think much of it. I thought, we'll go on the tour anyway, just humour me. So we went on this tour, and we were walking through an area which was known as the standalone prison. So it was an isolated standalone prison where the prisoners were kept in darkness, in the cells. They weren't allowed to communicate with one another. So it was in total silence. The whole standalone prison was totally silent. Not a word was to be spoken or heard. You weren't even allowed to cough. So that's how silent it was. Now, when the prisoners came out for exercise, they would come out of their cells, and because they weren't allowed to see or communicate, they'd have a bag over their head, like a cloth bag, and they would walk along the sides of the walls, and if they bumped into another prisoner, they weren't allowed to say anything. Which brings me to my experience. Now, we were in this standalone prison. Now, I knew the history of the standalone prison, and we're walking along, and we're in a group, and the wife and I are at the very back because I like being at the back of groups. It's great. So we're walking along, and we get past all these cells and everything, and then I felt a tap on my left shoulder. Now, I'm holding my wife with my right hand, and I just looked at her, and I said, don't have to be worried. It's fine. We are. It's only stories. And she looked at me, and she's gone, what the hell are you talking about? And I said, you're holding my shoulder, putting your arm around me. And she goes, you're holding my hand, you moron. I went, yes, I am. And I thought, okay, what's going on here? So I ducked into a cell thinking maybe there was someone in there hiding, but there's no one in there. But part of the story was, and I didn't know this at the time until afterwards, I knew that prisoners would walk up and down and, they weren't allowed to say anything. But when they came across another prisoner, and they bumped into them, they couldn't say anything, but they had to put their hand on their shoulder to say, stay where you are, I'm walking around you. And we were stationary at the time, looking into a cell when that happened.
Wow.
So for me, that was a personal experience that I will always hold and treasure to this day.
Definitely.
So, yeah, it's definitely got history, and it's definitely got some good stories there.
So are there any parts of the prison that feel threatening?
Very much so. There's a place called the Parsonage. I don't know if you've heard of the Parsonage before.
No.
The Parsonage was where they obviously kept the rector or parson was housed near the church there.
Yeah.
Now, one of the parsons at the time was a really, really evil man. Didn't like anybody, hated the world, and basically he should have been institutionalised in my eyes, but anyway, he was the parson there, and some of the people that go into the parsonage feel like they're under attack. While we were there one particular time, a lady comes screaming, running out of the building, and she felt that someone was strangling her. She was getting choked, and it got to the point where she was hysterical, so they called an ambulance for her. So it was very real, and she had marks around her neck, and it's like, well, she wouldn't have done that herself. Who the hell would do that to themselves? So the stories relating to the parsonage. Now, it's not the isolated case. It's happened on many occasions. People have felt that they've been grabbed and hair pulled and all sorts of things that happen. And it's very oppressive when you walk in there. Now, I've tried to call out the parson at the time when I've gone in there on my own. The wife and I have gone in there by ourselves. And, during the daytime, obviously not in the evening because it's all locked up. And I've tried to call him out, but he doesn't come out. And I've tormented him and I've done all sorts of things. But touch wood, he's not done anything to me personally. But you can feel it. When you walk in there, it just feels very oppressive. So that's some of the nasty stories that happen. So, yeah, there's a lot of buildings.
Like he attacks women more than men.
He attacks, he does, mostly women, but he doesn't like men either. There's been the odd man that's been sort of punched and come out with marks on, not knowing what the hell's gone on here. But, he's got a history, definitely, of attacking people. Yes, mostly women, definitely.
It sounds a bit of a bully, a bit of a sort of,
I think so. So I don't know what he was doing to the prisoners. I have no idea, because those sorts of things, those sorts of records were never kept.
No.
You'd never see that.
No.
Leaves it open to your imagination. Would have gone on.
Yeah.
So that's and he looked after the church there, and just a little bit of history about the church. The church stands there was never consecrated.
Oh.
So, and a story has it, and the facts do prove it. You can have a look for yourself. A lot of people go to this church so they can get married in the ambience of what the ruins are, but they reckon that most, if not all, of the marriages end up failing because the church is not consecrated, and it's supposedly an evil church. Don't know where they get the evil from, but it's, never unconsecrated church. So, and that church, that's also, if you look at the story of Port Arthur and the story of the church, there's a movie called For the Term of Natural Life. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I think I have.
Which is all based around the church and Port Arthur. So it'd be good to have a look at if anyone wants to look at it.
Yeah, what's it called again? For the term
of his natural life.
His natural life. I have heard of that.
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah, have a look at that.
Yeah, I will.
That's a great movie.
Okay. So, one of the things that I've talked to quite a few people about different prisons and around the world, to be honest, and one of the common denominators seems to be you should be more worried about the guards than the actual prisoners. Because
yes, no, I think you're right there. I think there's a lot of stuff that went on that we were never privy to.
Yeah.
And sure, not all these prisoners that had things done to them, they can't all be wrong, can they, when you put the numbers together?
Yeah. So have you had any experiences? I mean, you mentioned that amazing one with the prisoner sort of touching your shoulder to let you know he was going past you. You mentioned about the parsonage and the grumpy vicar who hates the world.
Hates the world, yes.
I'm not trivialising that because, I can imagine it. What about in the main part of the prison itself? What sort of vibe does that give off?
Oh, it doesn't actually give off really much of a vibe at all because there's not much left of the main prison. It's just a ruin now. It's been the walls are held up. You can't actually walk in it. There's a platform that walks through it, but it's all open. It's open to the environment. So to me, it's just a building. It doesn't have any of the emotion or any of the energy that I would consider to be there. It's silly as it sounds, but it's not an enclosed building. So therefore, it's not to me giving off that emotion. But speaking of guards, I do recall a story one time, again, while I was there was a lady and a gentleman. There was a married couple. They were from the States. They were here on holiday, and they were in our group, and they sort of wandered off, and they came back, a good 15 minutes later, and they joined back onto the group, and the tour guide said, where did you guys go to? And they said, we were talking to one of your costume theme people up there in the guards uniform. He was telling us about the history of the place and blah, blah, blah. And the tour guide said, well, we don't have anyone dressed in costume as a guard here. And I said, yeah. And they described the costume that this guard was wearing, and it was exactly to detail what one of the guards would have been wearing in the day. But yet they don't have any of those people walking around in costume. So I found that fascinating. Yeah, well, that's right. Because I'm thinking surely there must be, because reenactments are going on all the time.
Yeah.
I thought surely they would, but no, they don't. They don't actually have. Even now, I've been there a few times, and they don't. There's no one there in historical costume walking around. They have tour guides. They're just dressed as you and I, and they've got a guide on them. Yeah. And they'll just take you for a wander around the place. There's no actual people there dressed in period costume, which I find fascinating.
Wow. But that sounds like a nice guard, though. That doesn't sound like a bully guard, because
No, definitely not a bully guard. It was just a guard in general. I don't know of any of the bully guards that were there. I've not come across any history or stories relating to any bully guards, but I'm sure it happened as it happened probably today as well. Things we just don't hear about.
I think in especially prisons sort of 100 years, 150 years ago, before you had the regulations and the sort of the fact that prisoners now are given more rights, I suppose you could say. I do know that one of the experiences I had at Bodmin Jail in Cornwall, I think I got shoved by a guard because I talking to someone I know who investigates there on a frequent basis, when I told her an experience I had when I was there just in the middle of the day visiting it, and she said, yeah, that's the guard that patrols that area. And when I did a show on Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, some of the reports I read there, most of the sort of the more intimidating experiences attributed to guards.
Yeah.
So I guess they had to be a certain kind. Well,
you had to have something in you to be a guard in the first place, really, didn't you? It's not for the average person,
no.
Especially with what you're dealing with.
Yeah. Wow. So, what have you got? Any other stories that you can tell us about Port Arthur?
Well, Port Arthur or Tasmania or in general? I mean, Tasmania itself, beautiful island. Port Arthur is just one part.
Any more paranormal sort of stories? Any more sort of that sort of to do with the whole? I mean, one of the saddest things I think that's happened on that island and at Port Arthur was a horrible massacre back in '96. I'm not going to talk about it because there's obviously still people who survived but it's one of those things that it's quite a heartbreaking thing to read about.
Yeah, it is. Look, 1996, we did have the massacre, and you look, I don't like talking about it. It's still quite raw, even today for many of the victims' relations and relatives and friends who are still alive. So, when I talk about Port Arthur, I like to talk about the history and the ghosts of the past, where you know that obviously their ancestors may be alive today, but they didn't know them and they weren't attached to them as such. Yeah. Whereas you've got that still in the living today. So, out of respect for them,
I agree.
Out of respect for them, I generally don't sort of touch on it too much.
But I wanted to mention it to sort of pay respect to them and to know that, we're not. It's something that awful that's associated with the place.
It is, and unfortunately that Port Arthur doesn't have a great name at the best of times, even with the way it was. So having that happen certainly didn't help. But out of respect for the families, and I do pay the utmost respect to all those families, it is something that happened, and I'm sure in another 100 years' time they may talk about it a bit more in general and in detail. But and I just God rest them all, the victims, and sincere condolences to all the families of the living.
Definitely 35 people is horrific. But it does kind of, as you say, Port Arthur and the whole sort of convict side of things, transportation, doesn't have the best of reputations. But as I mentioned earlier, for some people, it was the making of them. You've got people who became top businessmen and businesswomen even in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of the chances they got through transportation as we said earlier, is to start their lives afresh.
To start their lives, exactly. And some of them did go on to be quite successful.
Yeah. And
we've got to pay homage to those as well.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole country, not just Tasmania, but the whole country, was just a penal settlement. That's all it was for. We were based on convicts. So our history from the very beginning is not the greatest history we've ever had. So we were based on convict labour and bad people, as it were. They were seen as bad people in the times, but then we've grown to become the country and the nation that we are today. So and a lot of thanks has got to be given to those people from the past that have started that all the way up through to the gold rush era, which if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be here today.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you look at different countries and you look at America, which has got a very, very strong religious sort of bias, if you like. Although saying that, we did actually try and set up penal colonies in America, in the 1800s. We also tried to set them up down in Cape Town in the 1800s, and both places said no, which is why I ended up also going to Australia. But
Australia was the unknown. That's why it was a large island. We didn't really know the extent of the size of it. We knew it was an island, but it was out in the middle of nowhere, out in the Pacific somewhere, and it was far from anyone. So why not colonise that and put it as a penal settlement?
Yeah. So the people the convicts who lived in Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, were known as Vandemonians because they had a certain kind of attitude. They had cocky sort of. Well,
yeah, absolutely, they did have because they were survivors.
Yeah,
that's why, and they had an air of arrogance about them, and quite rightly so. They were survivors. They survived some of the hardest times, on this land far away from anyone.
Yeah,
and they made it. So
if you could tell us one more story about Tasmania, Gary, what was your favourite story about Tasmania?
Oh, look, I've got many favourites. I can't really say I've got a favourite. I mean, I love Tasmania in general. It's a rough and rugged, beautiful place.
Beautiful. The pictures I've seen of it looks beautiful.
On convict labour. But, look, one of the other places I also frequent and is a place called New Norfolk, which is it's a little bit north of Port Arthur, not that far, probably about an hour's drive from Port Arthur, straight up. New Norfolk, there's an asylum there. And the asylum there, it predates Port Arthur. It's actually older than Port Arthur. It was there before the actual penal settlement was there. So it gives you an idea of what the times were like. So, I'd like to go and visit there. And I've got a few friends over there too, a couple of girls who have got their own team over there, and they run tours and all sorts of things. And they're known as the Van Diemen's Angels. So they've got a great tagline there. And they're both lovely girls, and they're both, to me, they're both opposite. They're like the good and the bad.
Yeah.
One's dark hair, one's blonde hair, one's good, one's nuts, and yin and yang. But look, they're beautiful people. They really are. So, and whenever I go over there, I pop over and I visit them, and we go and investigate the asylum. It's called Willow Court, by the way, the one in New Norfolk, and we go and visit there. And I tell you what, there's some beautiful things that come out of there, but there's also some negative things that come out of there. So I've had some great experiences. I may have to give the girls a call
and do a show on that one then.
Oh, you should. Look, they will give you some stories that will curl your toes. They really will.
Well, so if the asylum was built before Port Arthur was built. Well, it was used originally as a timber, something or other, from 1830 to 1833, and it was operational until about 1877. So,
yes, it was 1877 when it finished.
And then
it wasn't a long life.
About 10 years later.
Yeah, and then they decided that's enough. So the transportation had finished by then.
Yeah, so it wasn't actually in operation for that long. So when would Willow's Court have been built? Because didn't people start going to Tasmania from about the early 1800s?
Yeah, very early on. They were. Yeah, the actual the asylum. It predates Port Arthur by about 10 to 15 years. So you're looking at early 1820s. That sort of era. So it was there long before. Well, I say long before. It was there before the penal colony was there. So any of these people that were sent over to the mainland to be institutionalised or put into the penal system, some of them did go a bit mad, as you could imagine. And obviously they were shipped into Willow Court. But Willow Court itself is not. It was mainly set up for, as strange as it is, the rich, the people who are wealthy, the people who have got a lot of affluence about them and that sort of thing. So, that was set up for them. Occasionally they would go mad because they were pastoralists, there was nothing there, and they would call it stir crazy or cabin fever, whatever they called it. And so they set up the asylum for those type of people, not so much for the destitute, so to speak. But eventually later in life it became an all-round asylum, but it was deliberately set up originally for those who could afford it.
Right.
So, but look, there are many stories there, and if you get a chance, give the girls a call, have a chat with them, and I'm sure the listeners would love some of the things that come on out of Willow Court.
I'll do another 1 o'clock in the morning call. Or
You're
3
crazy.
o'clock in the morning, as it is now. Well, thank you so much.
That sort of time, I'm usually investigating or just about to hit the pillow.
Exactly. That's why I said normally I'm only up at this time when I've got a K2 in one hand and a torch in the other one. I don't even go out till this sort of time in the morning anymore. I stopped that about 15 years ago. Well, thank you so much for your help and your time this morning, tonight, whichever way you want to look at it, Gary. I really, really appreciate it. Really enjoyed talking to you. I think we could have talked for hours.
Oh, look, I can talk for hours. That's my downfall. I could be here for hours, but early hours of the morning there for you. I don't want to keep you up any longer, and it's Mother's Day here in Australia.
It's Mother's Day over down under, isn't it? So you've got to look after all those mums.
We do, and, hats off to all the mums around the world. You do a fantastic job.
Oh, thank you. Mine will probably get me up in about 4 hours. So.
Okay. All right. Well, look, it's been great chatting with you and having your listeners listen into my boring voice, my Australian accent. So I can say good day, but it's just Australian.
Oh, you've got to say good day. Good day, mate. Yeah.
Well, we've got to
have the cliches.
There's a word here. We call it a one word, but it's more like 5 words. But it's one word, and it's called "G'day, mate. How you going?"
Oh, love it. Love it.
That means "G'day, mate. How you going?" So we just call it a one word. One word with it, just one syllable. "G'day, mate. How you going?" That's it.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Gary. I really do appreciate it. You go and check Gary out if you've got any questions you want to ask him about. His 39 years of investigating, and what you didn't hear is some of the stuff we were talking about off air, about different experiences and everything else that are really, really interesting, and sort of do keep an eye on him. And obviously when that book comes out that himself and Anthony are writing, we will be talking about it, because it sounds a good one. I'm quite looking forward to reading this one.
It's going to be great. So
yeah, I'm looking
you guys
forward to
can visit us on our Facebook page. We've got a Facebook page, Forever Haunted. So by all means, drop by, have a look, and if you want to drop us a line anytime you like.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gary. I really, really do appreciate it. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show on Port Arthur and Tasmania. Obviously, Parasearch Radio shows on 6 nights of the week. You can catch up on all of them. If you haven't subscribed to our new YouTube channel, go and do it, because there's going to be special content coming on there very, very soon from all us various presenters. But all that really leaves me to say is thank you for listening. Hope you have a great evening. Sleep tight. And don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.